Okay, I think we are live. And hello, everybody, and welcome to another Journalift webinar. My name is Željko Trnjaković, and I'll be your host today. And today's webinar is on the topic of empowering women in media through policies and practice. And today currently we have two guest speakers with me. We're hoping, and we were planning to have three. One of the speakers is experiencing some technical difficulties. I hope she'll be able to sort them out soon and join us for that. But no matter, so we still have two very expert speakers for you. So just to give a quick intro into the topic. So today's topic is about empowering women in media through policies and practice. And we all know women journalists and editors have long stood as human rights defenders in the society and in the media industry. And in doing so, they have fought for rights, equality, and protection for all citizens and inclusions of minorities and vulnerable groups. Yet, full acknowledgement of women's competencies for equal participation in the society remains an evasive benchmark in much of the societies and media industry globally, but especially across the Western Balkan countries. So, equal representation of women and men at all organizational levels, as well as in the media content, is not about equality in numbers, as we all know, but about opening spaces for inclusion of perspectives and interests of women and other marginalized groups into the news and reporting that help builds audiences trust, journalistic impact, and ultimately contributes to media's promotion of social justice in the local communities. The Media for All project activities and initiatives seek to empower women journalists through training and peer learning, knowledge share and networking, mentoring programs, and policy developments. Now, my guest speakers today are Mrs. Larissa Halilovic. And Larissa is an experienced leader, trainer, coach, and mentor in the fields of education, government, and civil society and security. She was the director of the British Council in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and currently she's the Media for All project team leader based in Sarajevo. My second guest is Dr. Elena Stavrevska, who is currently a research officer at the Center of Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics and Political Science, researching gender-related policies, laws, and practice, and the recent Gender and Peacebuilding Research Fellow at the Kratz Institute for International Peace Studies, researching gender-related policies in post-war societies. And hopefully, and I see that she is just joining us, my third guest and speaker is Mrs. Valbona Kolgetsi, who is a media and communications expert, researcher, author, and trainer, former journalist and editor with extensive experience of work in the field of gender media and communication with the Albanian Media Institute and various international organizations. She's also an expert trainer in the Media for All project based in Tirana. So just to quickly confirm, Valbona, are you with us? And you can turn on the camera just in the toolbox, which is in the middle and the top of your screen. So just to confirm that you're with us, I see that you are joined in the webinar. Valbona, can you hear me or not? So again, so the camera and microphone options are in the toolbox that the audience doesn't see, but you should be able to see. So first is the camera, then microphone, then share screen, and so on. So, but the camera and microphone should be blue and turned on to initiate that. But I can see that the system has not registered your camera and microphone. So if you would just close the window, close the browser, and try to log in again with the same password. So Larissa Elena Valbona is trying to do it, but we're going to start without her. Before we dive into the content, for all of you viewers out there, so first of all, thank you for joining us. And the second of all, you have the chat window, which I see that you're already pretty much using and being very, very busy in it. We're going to monitor the chat. I'm going to monitor the chat once the speakers start elaborating on their topics, and we're going to ask questions at the end of the webinar. If you at any point experience any technical difficulties in the sense that you don't see us, you don't hear the sound, you don't see the picture, please refresh the window, or as I just recommended to Valbona, just shut off the browser itself and log in again with your link. It should clear up. That's what past experience has taught us. So let's dive into our today's topics. And the first thing that we want to talk about is media has the power to shape public opinion, and with it, the responsibility to represent women, men, and minorities in its content and in the newsroom in view of their competencies. So Larissa, I would like you to open this topic and say, what has been the approach of the Media for All project in furthering gender equality in media?
Thank you so much. And hello to all our participants. I see there are quite a few of you out there. Well, basically, first, let me give you a little bit of an overview of the project itself. Media for All is a project run by the British Council as the lead, together with Thomson Foundation, BIRN, and Interact across 6 countries of the Western Balkans. And this is the largest UK investment in media in this part of the world. And basically, we are focusing on several different areas when it comes to strengthening local independent media in these countries. So we're looking at strengthening the business and operation models. We're also looking at supporting the development of engagement with citizens in these countries, also focusing on the quality of content while doing that. Another very important area, which is the focus of our conversation this evening, is amplifying voices of women in the media and in the community. And also we're looking at strengthening and supporting youth-led media and young journalists. So we are working across different areas to basically provide both financial, technical, and mentoring support to these outlets in the 6 countries of the Western Balkans. Now, currently, we are working with over 100 media outlets. And basically, originally, we were going to approach this topic through doing some training and gender mainstreaming. Now, I know all of you who are in media know that you're very, very busy people. Training can be a good solution for people who have not finished the training or done it somewhere else. And we had some really exciting and serious topics to cover, including gender equality in media and safety of women and men journalists. But then we realized that unfortunately doing training is simply not enough, because we have done research which showed us some alarming stats. And basically now we have adapted our approach to make sure that we are not only working at individual and team level, but also engaging editors in the conversation. In addition to this, we are looking at women in media and providing mentorship programs and networking opportunities for women in media, which was not originally envisaged. And in addition to this, and Elena will tell us more about that, is the very important work on policies related to gender in media. Because as you know, we live in the Balkans. The overall state of play is still rather conservative, and as I mentioned, and we will talk about this later, stats are rather harsh in terms of equality of women and men in media. And we have found that unless we work on improving policies as well, it is very difficult to expect that things are going to change. So basically, we are now working across all these different areas, and I'll be happy to share some details additionally. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And in the middle of everything, I'm also trying to connect Valbona again to the webinar, which we see. Valbona, we can hear you, and she just left the room. Oh. Okay, so Elena, do you have anything to add to what Larissa just said?
Not much to add. I was one of the three researchers doing the initial study of the current situation across the Western Balkan countries, together with my colleagues Maja Bielos and Dr. Nita Luci. This was at the end of 2019 and 2020. And indeed, while on paper the situation legally, as far as the legal framework is concerned, and as far as gender equality ideas are concerned, it looks great. However, in practice, the situation is really different. And so this is why there was that additional push for better policies inside, as well as networking and learning from each other, because that is one of the things we also discovered, that the most progressive, the most gender inclusive work is actually done by networks of women journalists in the region. One thing that I thought at that time, and why these seminars or webinars rather are very important, one thing that struck me was there was hardly any research done across all countries. So there was no, the value of comparison and learning from each other was simply not there. And so in that regard, I think this and the work done by Media for All project is really critical. The media outlets I worked with as well learned probably just as much from each other as they did from me. So, and I learned from them as well. So I think this is another critical element, just to add to the things that Larissa already talked about.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. And just to expand on this, Larissa, so what Elena just said, so in your opinion, with the Media for All project and working with so many media outlets, do we see and hear enough stories about challenges faced by women and vulnerable groups and minorities in the society? Or is there still room for improvement?
Unfortunately, the stats are really bad. And it's not only about hearing the voices and stories, it's across all elements. So if you don't mind, I would actually take one step back and lead you through some of the key findings of our research. Now, I know some of you in the chat were in the session I delivered just half an hour ago, so this may be a repeat, but it's a good way to get those stats drummed into you. So basically, we have done research with 85 media outlets whom we are working with extensively and intensively across different areas of our engagement. And what we found was really striking. So we were expecting to see lack of representation and women not being equally represented. But what we saw was even worse than what we expected. So basically, first, we looked at women in leadership positions as owners, as board members, and as editors-in-chief. And we have found that basically amongst the 85 outlets that we are working with, at owners level, the spread is 70% of owners and senior leaders are men, while only 1/3 are women. And this is with an asterisk, because actually the outlets we are working with had one of the criteria that would give them extra points was women-led outlets. So it's even worse in the wider sphere than this. Then when you go one step down to board level and directors level, here the ratio is a tiny bit improved. It's 60-40, so 60% men and 40% women amongst the 85 outlets we're working with. And then when you get to the level of editors, there it's nearly or roughly the same. 45% men and 55% women. So there we're nearing equality. And then we get to the level of operational work, where actually journalists who signed the articles that we analyzed, and I must emphasize that we analyzed over 2,000 pieces across the 85 outlets in the 6 countries. So it's a significant sample we're looking at. Journalists are 60% women and 40% men. So we thought, okay, great. This is where things get better. So this must mean that in the actual texts or in the content or videos they produce, women will be subjects and objects of the stories. However, this is where things got really, really worrying, because we found that despite the fact that women are, let's say, in majority when it comes to writing, when it comes to subjects of the stories, they are there only 1/3 of the time. And when it comes to objects of our stories, they're only there 1/5 of the time, which was really shocking. I mean, I was expecting not to see much because we're exposed to media on a daily basis, but this was really, really striking. And then going exactly to the point you asked about, Željko, to what extent, women's issues or minority issues of any sort are represented in the content, we're talking about 7%. And this is ridiculously low. I mean, I'm sorry for being that honest, but really 7% is just not good enough. And needless to say, gender-sensitive language across the 6 countries is still being used really, really poorly and scarcely, despite the fact that majority of the languages actually have gender-sensitive nouns, forms, etc. So all in all, stats are looking really, really bad, which at the same time is an opportunity for us all to work together to change this. Thank you. I'll stop here.
While we're on the subject of statistics, I have a question from the audience. So did you do a comparative analysis with the data in Europe, and how does the Western Balkans stand in comparison to Europe?
Thanks for this question. So basically, there are bits and pieces of research coming through. Currently, there is a large piece of research which has just been published, and we're about to compare our data. But basically, our data to some of the European standards, but still a lot worse, So maybe I see that Elena has her hand up, so I'm sure you're going to bring out some of the actual stats in this. But basically, Balkans has a long way to go when it comes to gender equality representation. I'll pause here and hand over to Elena, who will give us some details.
Yes, so there is something called the Global Media Monitoring Project, which every few years, I don't know how the pandemic has changed this for them, but every few years it publishes a report on representation of, among other things, women's presence and portrayal and representation in the media on a global scale. So it used to be every 5 years. I don't know how that is now, but the latest data that we have is from 2015, when they monitored more than 22,000 stories in print, radio, television, internet, and Twitter news in 114 countries. I'm sorry, I'm having a lot of...
No, okay, so I just muted. Valvona is trying to connect, but I just muted her. So please continue, Elena, while we see if we can get her.
So of these 22,000 stories in 114 countries, they were presented or reported by 26,000 journalists, containing 402 people interviewed or as subjects. The study found that only 24%, that women were only 24% of all the persons heard, read about, or seen in newspaper, television, and radio news, which is the same rate as 2010. So basically, there has been no increase at a global scale. So the Western Balkans is not. That's also the bad news, is that the Western Balkans is not really that different from the global trend. And if I can add one more piece of statistics here, is that in 2010, in the world's media, only 19% of spokespersons and 20% of experts were women. While in contrast, 41% of spokespersons and 80% of experts in the news were men. So that, I think that data speaks for itself. When it comes to women's issues, which I'll speak about more later on, it's not only that they are present very little, but it's also about how they're present.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. So just to try and see if Walbona is with us. Walbona, I muted you, so you need to unmute at the top of the screen. You see the camera and the microphone button. So can we see if you are with us?
Yes, I have unmuted myself. And
cool.
This is camera. Okay.
And the camera. Yes, we have Walbona. Thank you. Cool. Okay, no problem. So good. Great to have you. We just started, so we're just doing the initial question. We haven't got to your part yet, but it's good that we have you here and welcome. So let's move on. So we continue with women journalists still fight for equal employment opportunities, equal pay, professional integrity, and access to managerial positions globally. So why are newsroom policies important in this regard? And if we have some examples of how these policies have been presented and implemented, Elena, would you start on this question?
Sure. So again, I'll go back to the research we did, because we are driven by research in what we do. We found that, of course, in all 6 countries of the Western Balkans, there are laws for gender equality, or sometimes it's called equality between women and men, which is problematic in and of itself because of the binary thinking of gender. But these laws are in place. In some cases, there are also anti-discrimination laws. Also, each and every one of these countries also has a code of ethics of journalists. Among those codes, there's only one which actually uses a gender-sensitive language, which shockingly, to those of us who know the stereotypes of the region, is Montenegro, actually. So Montenegro uses novinare and novinarke, while, as Larissa already mentioned, all the languages in the region do have gender-sensitive, the possibility of using gender-sensitive language with using the nouns already. So the framework is there. However, the policies, how that translates to the level of the media is problematic, because it doesn't translate in most cases. In most cases, people that I've interviewed, journalists and editors alike, have said that, and I think some of the media outlets will say that themselves, that they have a code of ethics, but not their own, just the one of the country. The one of the country usually would, or the country journalist associations, but that one usually says nothing about gender. To say nothing, of course, of the language it uses. Nothing about gender, nothing about inclusion of women, let alone minorities or other vulnerable groups. So in that sense, the newsroom level policies are absolutely critical. And they're absolutely critical in 3 different ways. One is at the recruitment and training stage, because we unfortunately know that in classical education, not all journalists are trained in having a gender-sensitive approach, both towards the newsroom and towards the content that's produced. The second one is in terms of career advancement. So as Larissa was saying, that we see what, in corporate speak would be called a leaky pipeline, where there are a lot of women who work as journalists while they never reach editorial level, let alone board positions. And in this sense, it is not that women journalists are paid less than men journalists. It's just that there is a higher percentage of women in positions that are less paid, if that makes sense. And I see that Dragan is sharing the statistics I was talking about. So you can check that out in the chat. And the third aspect where policies are important is workplace safety. So research also shows, and we also know from anecdotal evidence, that it is women journalists that are, and not just women journalists, I should also mention LGBTQI journalists in some cases as well, are the ones who are more subject to violence, online violence, sometimes physical violence, safety threats. And in that sense, the media outlet needs to be. I'm hearing a lot of background noise. I don't think it's from me.
Valbona, can you mute until I call
Yeah,
you?
sure.
Just mute. Yep, thank you.
So we worked on all these three levels. How can a media outlet ensure that all journalists, and this is critical as well, because oftentimes when there's gender-related training, it is the women that are sent, while every single journalist needs to, and editors alike, needs to be trained in some of these things. So we try to incorporate in the policies what kind of training needs to happen for everyone. What kind of career advancement possibilities can be opened up to everyone in the media, and the one that we found most critical was how do we ensure workplace safety between colleagues, but also from the public. And there are some amazing examples amongst the media outlets that are included in Media for All. I will give a shout out. I don't know if any of them are present, but I'll give a shout out to at least two that I used this very positive example. One is the Center for Investigative Journalism of Serbia, which has a fantastic code of ethics, so for internal matters, but also fantastic guidelines on how they report on things, how they protect their journalists as well, especially given the environment in which they are working right now. And then the second one is Forum Žena Prijepolja, or TV Forum, which is actually, it grew out of an NGO set up by women. So the focus is not just on issues that relate to women, but the focus is very much on promoting gender equality through what they do. So pretty much, walking the walk that they talk. And of course, I was also very proud to see, and I see some of those media outlets or some representatives are present in the chat as well. I work with 14 media outlets of the grantees, and some of them developed really good policies. Most of them developed a very gender-sensitive code of ethics, so internal document. Many decided to also develop guidelines for gender-sensitive reporting as well as ethical reporting. So very going into the nitty-gritty of what needs to happen, what are the steps, from assigning stories to how stories are reported to how they engage with the public and so on. And then few of the media outlets also decided to actually write guidelines on using gender-sensitive language, which I mean, we are yet to see how the implementation of this is going. So maybe that's something to be heard from the media outlets. But it was them learning from each other as well, as I said previously, of what's something that works in practice that but hasn't been codified, and what are some things that they would like to see. Sorry, I've been going on maybe for a bit too long, but I'll stop there now.
It's okay. And it's okay. Before we move on to, and we're going to talk more about safety, but in your experience, and you mentioned that a lot of these media outlets already developed some policies and guidelines. So what worked well in your approach to developing these policies? Is there anything that other media outlets that didn't do it should know or should try to kind of experience from others?
Yes, so few things worked well. One was trying to understand where each media outlet is and meet them where they are. So TVM from Ohrid, another good example, had a lot of these in practice. They hadn't codified anything, but it was sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken rule of the workplace. So in those cases, it was quite easy. It was quite straightforward. We sit down and we talk about how it can be implemented. In some cases, we face the challenge of the size of the media outlet, right? if you have two journalists and one editor, obviously, if the editor is the one doing some kind of a breach of any kind of workers' rights, who would you report to, right? So there's the issue of size and accountability in some ways. So it was brainstorming with the media outlets, but something that, again, I mean, I keep stressing this, that I found very, very valuable was how much in the discussion among the media outlets, they figured out things and taught each other. We had one editor from a media outlet who was saying, is it offensive to say this and this? And of course, it was offensive, but that is not the point. The point is that other representatives who were present would explain and try to find a constructive way to explain why that can be tackled from a different perspective. So what worked really well was, again, as I said, that collective approach. And I think for a lot of people, the statistics, showing them the statistics was what clicked. Because, as I said, anecdotally, we all know about stories. But seeing that this is a trend and the statistics are devastating, it was kind of a call for action for many of the people and the outlets I worked with. Okay, so again, before we move on, so Valbona, Larissa, do you have anything to add as far as your experience in what works well in developing these kinds of policies?
I would like to add to what just Elena said, because it reminded me of an effort made in 2012 in Albania with a local television called ETV, Elbasan ETV, which is 30 kilometers from Tirana. It was a project from UN Women trying to make media more women-friendly. And we proposed to work in the field with a journalist to develop some stories that had gender perspective. And I remember myself talking kind of 10 years ago with a psychologist from the University of Tirana, with the staff of that local television. There were 5 people in total, about the importance of having gender balanced stories. And they were looking at us like we were speaking alienish. So what are you talking about? So I realized that maybe it was a little bit early for them to understand the importance of the issue, but still we insist to start by small steps, let's say baby steps. And we talked with editor-in-chief. She was a woman journalist, and 2 journalists they had at the time, about the ways how to integrate gender resources in their reports. And we managed to produce kind of 2 to 3 TV reports when the sources were balanced. But after that, it was kind of faded out. So the whole effort was left there as a project that was done by someone who was external, but not really embedded in their structure. The local television nowadays, it doesn't exist anymore, but it reminded me of the resistance we had. And even there were local television. I mean, nowadays when I see mainstream media, national televisions that really refuse to tackle the gender dimension of the news reporting and newsrooms, it seems to me that it is a cultural thing, most of all.
Thank you so much. Larissa, do you have anything to add to this?
Only to say that as much as we want to initiate change, it's really hard. Because even if we look at our own language, for example, I work in mentorship quite a lot. And one of the areas we have introduced in this project, as I mentioned, is mentorship for women. I listened to a video I recorded a year ago to do with mentorship. And the language I used only a year ago was not gender sensitive. I was calling myself a man mentor, when in reality I'm a woman, and we all know it. So this is just an illustration to say, you know, it really does take time and effort for every single individual to actively work on even changing little things such as gender sensitive language. Because the difference of me saying that I am a mentorka and not a mentor it sounds like a really banal thing, but it's huge. And when you listen to the piece, the actual impact on those listening is completely different. Now imagine how different content could look if all the editors, and also this includes proofreaders and translators who are working in our languages in the Balkans, who are sometimes, unfortunately, part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Imagine if we all got on board and said, we are going to use gender-sensitive nouns and gender-sensitive forms in everything we do, and that someone actually checked that this was the case. I recently delivered a workshop for women entrepreneurs. You wouldn't believe that every single one of them talked about themselves in male format. Every single one of them. And when I pointed that out, they were surprised. They weren't even aware. So I believe that the change starts with first raising of the awareness and then conscious effort to actually do something different, because it's not going to happen just like that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So we talked about safety, and women and both journalists and women editors are exposed to mobbing and discrimination, sexism, political pressures, threats from criminal centers, discrediting, physical threats, online threats, all of which take specific shapes of threats to women journalists because they are women. So we know that it's an issue for both men and women. So Valbona, can you take the lead on this, and can you tell us, has this been recognized, and are newsroom policies enough, or do we need other mechanisms to ensure accountability in situations of serious violence and threats? Sorry, you're muted. So just.
Thank you for the question. I would like to answer to this question by yes, there is a different exposure of women journalists to discrimination, sexism, threats both offline and online, but unfortunately it is not the case. In the Balkans, as I see it, but in Albania especially. Why I say unfortunately? Because if it was a question only for women journalists, I would like to think that we are doing media like in normal countries where freedom of expression is guaranteed and the gender aspect of it is still unregulated. But when I say that there is no difference between men and women regarding the safety at work, it regards the profession as such. So it is not safe to be a journalist, both men and women in the Balkans nowadays, as it is, because the threats from criminal groups and political pressure, unfortunately, are the same, both men and women. But I would differ that when it comes to sexism, discrimination, and attacks online, smear campaign, I would agree that these are mostly directed to women journalists. And we have plenty of examples here in Albania, at least regarding the last 4 attacks on women journalists. And one of them was attacked verbally by militants of Socialist Party at the entrance of the Parliament of Albania when she was questioning the former Minister of Interior about the charges on organized crime and narco traffic in Albania. And the militants called her ugly and man-face because she was not beautiful according to the standards of the audience then. On another case, we had a campaign against the moderator of a talk show, TV, in Albania regarding her aesthetic intervention. And she got involved in a verbal conflict with a pundit, opinionist, in television, underlying the fact that she was not doing her job properly because she was too much invested in her aesthetic chirurgical intervention. And this gives floor to a massive negative smear campaign online, because we should understand that nowadays you don't have in front of you only the attacker, but also this internauts, how to call it, the internet people, who find space to attack you personally. On the other side, we have had examples of high officials, including Prime Minister and Vice Prime Minister, intimidating women journalists live on debates and calling them incompetent and unprepared because of their motherhood aspects, because one of them was having a baby at the time. So the Prime Minister said that you have come unprepared because your baby has left you to prepare for the task you are doing. And today, it was a coincidence that the former Vice Prime Minister called another prominent journalist who is leading a TV program show in the evening, in prime time. He called her Kazetare, which is a mix of Kazan, what the Prime Minister called media in general, like Le Pot, you know, and journalist, Gazetare, and making fun of her because she said something that he didn't like. So in general, I would say that the climate against women in general, at least in Albania, doesn't help women journalists to do their battle, because there is this sexist discourse all over the places and in the media as well. Because we have had, for example, the former Vice Speaker of the Parliament calling the Ombudswoman a peach, and comparing parts of judge's body with car parts. And nobody made an issue about it, nor the journalist. And even the media doesn't know how to report on this thing. So I think that the whole campaign against women journalists is fueled by this anti-women discourse and sexist discourse, which is supported by the public opinion. They don't see it as something that it is a normal or not normal. They have normalized it. So when you attack a woman in public, be it a judge, a victim of domestic violence, I don't know, a member of the parliament or a high official because she is a woman, nobody reacts. They think this is normal, so go forward with it. So it shouldn't come as a surprise when we have this kind of discourse towards the women journalists. And when it comes to recognition of it, I think it has started to be recognized as something that it is directed to the gender dimension, but not fully elaborated on it, because journalists in Albania and I think in the Balkans are on survival mode. So discussing about challenges you face as a woman journalist seems like a luxury. So when it comes to safety, you should, or going forward as a community group, I mean, men and women, both treating the threats from organized crime or political pressure, or when somebody of you is attacked, you should form like a coalition and support her on her battle to put the dignity in place, because nowadays these episodes that I have mentioned have become isolated. So you feel alone. If I am the journalist that got intimidated by a government official online, I will handle it personally. Nobody will come into my help and saying that, or the Union of Journalists, for example, that this is not right and you should apologize for the way you are treating journalists and women journalists in particular. Are newsroom policies enough to counteract this kind of attitude? I think yes and no. First, because we don't have newsroom policies. So what I know about safety protocols in Albania, only Birn has one of it because of the specificity of the work they are doing. They are investigative journalists, and they are becoming kind of more aware now that men and women face risk differently. But in the other newsrooms, there is hardly a discussion about safety protocols, and I have testified this myself during the first cycle of trainings I had in the Media for All project with local media, both in Kosovo and in Albania, that it was the first time journalists started to reflect on the need to have safety protocols in their newsrooms. I'm happy to share with you the fact that some of them, 2 of them at least, have started to write safety protocols for themselves, Durusline, and I think another media outlet. But this is not massive. And I don't think that only with newsroom policies you'll change that. You need also this climate around you that see the journalists not as enemy of the people or as Kazan. And you have also to gain the support of the public, who has started to delegitimize media from its own function and mission. So when they attack a journalist, they don't see anymore if it is a man or a woman. They see a journalist that is a liar or is doing fake news or is a traitor or something like that. So it is a multi-front battle we should talk about when coming to safety of the journalist, and also involvement of the state structure. I mean, the police, who should treat more seriously the denunciation of the journalists about the attacks, and the prosecutors and the judges and the courtrooms, and the model of the media itself. I think it doesn't help having the model of media we have in the Balkans, like in a sandwich. You have the political pressure and the pressure from the media owners, and the journalists are left alone from this political pressure or threats from business owners, because they don't see them as journalists. They see them as soldiers to produce things that they will use for their own business. Sorry for the gray situation, but yeah. I think that it is best to say what is happening.
Thank you for the answer.
Reality.
Yeah, Valbona, and it kind of directly leans on the next topic, because the issue of safety, as much as it needs to be addressed at all levels, including the public and the state, somehow probably best starts in-house. So so we then can talk about the inclusion of women as leaders in media newsrooms, committees, boardrooms, associations, and this has been long called for. So, Larissa, can you tell us about some statistics? You already mentioned some of them, but moreover on the statistics, can you also lean on what would be the organizational benefits of including women as leaders in the media industry? And one surely would be to kind of get the in-house support from what we just talked about, this grim situation when a woman reporter and is experiencing safety issues.
Thank you so much for the question. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, our statistics are showing that only 30% of women are in leadership positions. But actually, I think one of the participants asked in the chat earlier if we had seen the stats in Serbia that were released last year, where actually, if you take into account all the mainstream media, and especially some of the media influenced, let's say, by the politics, these numbers are even lower. So I think it was about 18% of women in senior leadership positions in Serbia in the piece of research that the participant was referring to. But what Valbona was pointing out here really does bring with it again, the importance of having women in leadership positions for many, many reasons. One is the fact that, for example, when we did our training on safety of women and men journalists, in the sessions we had to follow up, for example, the protocols you were talking about, Valbona, we were hearing things like, the first time I was slapped was in 1991. And this is a quote from a journalist in Bosnia and Herzegovina who works on the ground. And other participants asked her, do you mean slapped in terms of, the language used? And she said, no, I'm talking about being slapped physically. And the more we went into the conversation, we realized how important it was to actually create space for sharing of these stories. And very often, women feel safer having the space to discuss these issues with other women. It's just the fact. Then, in terms of having the support at leadership level, we have also found through our mentorship program that very often women don't have support. I'm not saying this is always the case, but in-house or across the journalism community, it's a bit of a battlefield or even a bit of a competition from time to time. What we are actually trying to introduce and advocate for is the importance of mentorship amongst women in media to support one another. So this is one of the reasons why we introduced mentorship program for women in media in Western Balkans, to actually give space to women who are, let's say, early on in their careers, to have access to people like Valbona herself, who are there to really support them, to offer a lending hand, and also to give them space to air their concerns and maybe learn things from experience and support of someone who has had this experience in the past. And in addition to this, of course, we want to see women in leadership positions, but we can't make women do that. However, we need to create space through policies for this to be possible at all. And finally, another thing that's missing from the conversation, and when you were talking about feeling lonely, Valbona, when you are under attack, we have discovered that, for example, in Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have networks of women in journalism who very often will support their colleagues when something goes wrong. And this is good practice, because it's not the same when you are just there left alone with no comment at all and feeling all that pain and anger and shame and blame and everything else that comes with these comments. When you compare it to when a whole association or a union of other professionals who also happen to be women are there to support you and to say that this is not acceptable. And what we would like to do through our project is actually initiate creation of such networks locally in countries that don't have them. So I know in Albania, they don't yet have a specific network for women in media. I know there are versions of it, but not as specific as this. And also in the region, by doing training sessions together, we have found that issues are common. Okay, there are particularities, but actually issues that women face as journalists and as editors and as professionals in media are often common. And we would like to see women across Balkans connect as journalists and actually, support each other in these challenging situations, but also in lobbying for a better status within the profession and in the community. Because only by, addressing it at all these different levels, we talked about a level of individual, we talked about teams and newsrooms, we talked about policies, but I also think it's hugely important to talk about networks. And finally, the support of men. Because, Željko, without your support and support of male colleagues like Dragan, like Ognen, like Ilcho, and many others who I see in the chat are with us today, women simply don't have the visibility that we need to have in order to make this change. So it's a multifaceted answer to your question. But yes, in leadership positions and through all these other means, we need to make the difference. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And when we talk about gender equality in media, we don't only talk about women journalists. We also talk about media's reporting on gender-based violence and femicide, and which still remains a sore spot in editorial and journalistic practice. While, on the other hand, responsible reporting and constructive engagement of media is called for. So, Elena, if and how development of newsroom policies and guidelines, can it assist in addressing these challenges within the media?
The short answer is yes. So yes, indeed, both in the research and in the mentoring, in the development of policy stage, we worked on both, as I said, inward-looking and outward-looking policies and research as well. So both how women are represented, but also how they're portrayed. And research, and this will surprise absolutely no one, women in the Western Balkans, and not only, but we looked at the Western Balkans, are generally portrayed in one of two ways in media. One is in traditional and stereotypical roles, so as mothers or wives. And while there's nothing wrong with that, that is not all that women can be. And the second form is not always mutually exclusive. The second form is in a sexualized and objectified manner. So even when they are portrayed, they're portrayed in these ways. So one thing that all of our societies have experienced especially since the 90s, is repatriarchalization. So I think there's a lot of unlearning to be done on the part of all of us. And so something that Larissa was talking about earlier, in the language we use, the way we express ourselves as well. So there's a lot that can be done internally as well, even though obviously, as Valbona was mentioning, there's a major climate of anti-gender movements in the region. So this is no shock at all. So as I said, these are this is the usual portrayal. Then issues such as gender-based and sexual violence, violence against women, and women's rights more broadly are rarely covered. I mean, probably mainly on 8th of March, and that's where it begins and ends by and large. But even when they're covered, they are covered in not always a professional way, and I'll speak about this in a second. But I also want to mention that people from smaller ethnic minorities, as well as LGBTQ+ people, rarely feature in any stories. This is the case across the whole region again. So while there are exceptions here and there, the trend holds across all countries. So now, one positive thing that that exists in the region is that there have been quite a few, compared to zero. There are some, and I think that is precisely what Masha is sharing in the chat. Thank you, Masha. There have been various practical guidelines on gender-sensitive topics. So one is the guideline that Masha has shared. Then UN Women in Macedonia, or North Macedonia, has produced something to this extent as well. So there are some guidelines that exist in different countries, even though then there's the question of how that is integrated in different media outlets. One thing that we notice again across the region when it comes to covering specifically gender-based violence and violence against women, as well as femicide, is that often the identity of the survivor and the family members is revealed. Frequently, we see a tendency of shifting responsibilities from the violence from the perpetrator to the survivor, if the person survives at all, of course. There sometimes are information of justifying the act of violence, be that the way someone is dressed or the way someone has behaved or the relationship that the perpetrator and the victim or the survivor have had prior to the incident. Again, often it's portrayed in a sensationalist and stereotypical manner when referring to the violence, and to say nothing of the visual representation. So even in visual terms, we're not. I think that there's not always a concern that too is subject to ethical guidelines, and that too needs to protect those who have already suffered violence. So I'll conclude with just one or two sentences, referring again to the media outlets that I work with. So when I said earlier that we have to meet people and media outlets as well where they are, I think it's also important to understand success in very small increments. If many of them complain that if there's a gender-sensitive language, like that would increase the length of the reporting, or that we might have to make up new words. So of course there was a discussion about language being, of course, a living material that needs updating as well. And so then also when reporting on these issues, if at least one of the media outlets, and there was more than one, realized that there is important to have guidelines in place on how to report, as well as trainings on those guidelines. So not just more paper, but guidelines and trainings for journalists, women and men alike, on how to report on these issues. That is already, I would consider that a success. So they don't have to go for the maximum of gender equality. Incremental steps. In 2 more years, maybe they'll decide to take the next step. But even the smallest of steps, I think, counts in portraying the reality that actually exists, but also doing that in an ethical way.
Great. So basically, we all agree that gender equality is something that must be actively promoted and worked on. And Larissa mentioned already a mentoring program for women, which is a novelty in our region. So Valbona, I'm going to ask you this final question for you, and then I'm going to ask all of you a final question because we're nearing the end of the webinar. So how has the mentoring program for women, has it shown its value? And moreover, what are the other possibilities of actively promoting gender equality, and when and where should it start? Mute. Yeah.
Well, the mentorship program was a novelty for the Balkans, even for us who have years in the training area and lecturing and all stuff. But I think it started a new era, how to support each other and linking the old generation of 2 decades, old journalists with young journalists, because we should acknowledge that we are living in a different time when we started doing journalism. And sometimes this whole thing about technology, social media, and the whole criticizing gaze that we have towards the young journalists is not always real, because sometimes it might hide a fear of us not being updated enough with the new tools of journalism. So for me personally, the mentorship program was an excellent opportunity to exchange ideas, to know each other better, and also to give the young generation of journalists some tools and some energizers to motivate them to continue this journey, which is not easy, especially in this time, because when I remember myself doing journalism in 1998 in Tirana, reporting on illegal constructions, and I got a direct threat by an owner of an illegal construction in the center of Tirana not to broadcast the report. It was 1998, and I've never experienced such a direct threat, but kind of a small scale, because he was kind of a small commercial person. And then I realized that this profession brings also risk. Of course, I have broadcasted the report, but I have discussed with my cameraman how to deal with that person personally, because we came to know that he was somebody who knew some of our, let's say, family members and stuff. But nowadays, you have this risk multiplied, because you have not only direct threats, but also online threats by anonymous person, and it is not easy to face alone all this campaign that might be direct against you. So the mentorship program in this regard was very fruitful to, how to say it, to not to support each other, but to have the back of each other, and to encourage this young generation of journalists to stay true to their mission and not to be frightened by the risk of the profession, because this is something that happens all the time. But if we know the right ways how to address it, it will be minimized. And here I would like to link something with what Larissa said about leadership position of women. And I think that we need more women in leadership position to change the status quo. Because if we have women in position that treat journalists as soldiers, as slaves, with no respect for their safety or life, why bothering having more women in leadership position? We need a different model of working in journalism, respecting the rights of everyone, be it man or woman, and also leave space for personal life rather than the professional life, because I can understand in 1998 when I entered the profession, I had only 20 hours at work and only 4 hours for myself. But now that I am mother of two, I cannot accept myself to work like that. And no journalist should be obliged to choose between personal and professional life. And we all know that this is especially true for women, because they have family responsibilities that are much heavier than men's. Although we have a young generation of dads and fathers who are looking more after their personal life. So in this context, I would call the mentorship program as a good seed to see the emerging of a new movement of journalists, not only women and girl journalists, but journalists in general, to have the back of each other and to be kind of a group of interest when it comes to their rights, because their profession is directly linked with the health of our society and our democracies. So to conclude, besides mentorship programs, I think that investment, professional training, and early education on gender issues and media literacy is indispensable, because we should know that we live in deep patriarchal societies. And we cannot wait for a journalist to enter the profession without the basic knowledge how gender implicates our narrative and how it implicates our lives. And this is the case nowadays. So not even in the journalism schools, we don't have subjects that deal with gender issue, or in high school. But if you see Western countries, they have this subject covered even in the elementary schools. High school, okay, it's a must, and then the university. But other than this, we should recognize also the problem we have with the audiences, because when you have audiences that understand how wrong it is to attack a woman because she is a woman, you will have fewer and fewer cases of attacking women journalists. But because in the surface, we might seem emancipated and having a young generation of journalists who fight for their rights and speak their voice, but underneath, we have a big problem of mentality of the audiences who justify everything that it is done against women because they are women. So investment, curricula, schooling, and mentorship programs, I think all will do the work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we are nearing the end of the webinar. We have gone a little over time, but I don't think any of our viewers are going to mind. I'm going to leave one final question. If there were no other questions from the audience, and the audience, you should know that we're here still for a couple of minutes. So if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to leave them in chat and I will call them out. So one final question for all, and we already gave several examples and suggestions and practices. How is this already being done? So in your own opinion, what is your advice, and what can be done to improve the gender equality in media right now, which will also be a value in the future? So let's start with Larissa, and then Elena, and then Valbona. So Larissa, take it off.
Thanks very much. I think Valbona already covered a huge topic, which is to do with early education and introducing gender as a subject. But when it comes to media, I think we all have the responsibility to first start with ourselves, to look at the language we use, to also look at whom we invite as experts, because women can and are represented as experts in their fields, and they need to be visible. So we need to start inviting women for opinions that are other than beauty and cooking and motherhood. You know, we have important things to say. Similarly, working on policies is hugely important. I know it's hard to introduce new policies when you only have 2 or 3 people in the newsroom, but at the same time, if you don't, when things go wrong, then there is nothing to actually hang yourself on. And it's really important that we start with the basics and with the standards. And then finally, all these other things which we discussed, training, mentoring, networking, and sticking together, as Valbona said, in terms of common interests. where we all want to actually contribute to improved journalism is what, again, we all have the responsibility of doing that. Women and men in the profession only together can actually initiate the change that's really needed. And then we can see the shift in the really atrocious statistics which we were commenting on at the beginning. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. Elena.
There's very little left to say. I agree fully with what Valbona was saying, what Larissa just added. I'll add two more things. One is that I mentioned earlier the anti-gender movement, and that is getting much, much stronger in the region. We see these summits of defending patriarchal families and whatnot, where leaders from our region do attend and actively promote that. So we're not fighting the status quo anymore. We're fighting an actual enemy, I dare say. And I think there we all have a responsibility. So not just journalists or just women journalists for that matter, but all of us as a society, I think we need to do what we can in our respective fields to push back against this, because I think it's a very, very dangerous movement. And it's an invisible one, which is even more problematic. That's the first point. The second point is about visibility of women. So just to add to what Larissa was saying, in a frustration, well, this is also promoting something. In a frustration a few years ago of just seeing manels all over the place, as if we have no experts in the region, or if we only have women's experts for gender-related issues. Somehow, miraculously, when there's an issue of gender, they all manage to find women speakers. But if it's politics or economics or, God forbid, business, it's very much a manel. So in responding to that frustration, I created a Twitter list called Women Also Know Balkans. And now we're trying to push things further to actually create an online database where journalists as well as others can search and find women experts. So just to say that at some point I might reach out to all of you to sign up, let people know to sign up, so that we also make the work easier if that is really the issue, because there's always, oh, they're not free or we couldn't find one. So there are tools out there to make things easier as well. And I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
Okay, super. Thank you, Valbona. For the end, do you have anything to add?
Yes, just two little things. First, I am more and more convinced that gender equality will have success in the media only if it is intentional, because everything else that it is imposed by projects or by someone else, that it is outside the media industry, will not have success. But I am optimistic that we are creating the conditions for these things to be intentional. Because if you have journalists that are more aware of their power and of their rights in the newsroom, they will fight for it and they will make it intentional. The second thing is that instead of fix women in the workplace, it is media, fix the workplace, because it is wrong. And the model we have nowadays, it is not a model that it is working for men and women. So, starting with the model of the media, the business interest, the political pressure, and all stuff. And if the climate will change, then the gender equality will happen. This is something we should be aware of. Thanks.
So with that note, I'm going to thank all the experts and especially ladies that have been joining me as my guests for this webinar. And I'm going to thank you to all of the viewers that have been viewing the entirety of this webinar, with none of you leaving in the middle of the webinar. You've been very good. So thank you, ladies, for joining me for this webinar, another journalist webinar on the topic of empowering women in media through policies and practice. And thank you to the audience. Keep an eye out. There's going to be a recording of this webinar coming out soon, and we're going to have another webinar or two in November this year, and another one in December, and so on and so forth. So ladies, just so you know, when we end the webinar, it's going to end the call. So I thanking you from the bottom of my heart for taking the time and sharing your expert opinions and insights into this very important topic. To everyone else, thank you and goodbye.